All right. Hello, my name is Justin Ruin, and I'm a policy analyst with the Association of Idaho Cities. And I'm here to present on the basics of the city budgeting process. I hope that you will find this presentation helpful as your city approaches the budgeting season this summer, and also keep your eyes peeled for the AIC budget manual that will be coming out in a few weeks as well, that will provide more detailed information on the budgeting process. And also the budget calendar will be posted on the AIC website, so there will be a lot of resources coming out very short order to help you through the budgeting process. So the basics of the city budget process are that we have a fiscal year that runs from October 1st through September 30th, and each year the city prepares and adopts a budget for the upcoming fiscal year. And in conjunction with the budgeting process, the city also sets its property tax levy to fund the tax-supported services like streets, police, fire, parks, and libraries. Cities also typically review their utility rates and other fees as part of the budgeting process. The council has a very important role to play in budgeting, and that is one of the powers that are really firmly within the council's wheelhouse. Budgeting is really one of their most important responsibilities under state law. So what does that exactly include? Certainly setting the city's property tax levy, utility rates, and other fees to fund the city's services, deciding if any new services will be provided by the city and how those will be funded, what levels of service should the city provide, are you going to construct new police and fire stations, and how many new police, firefighters, and EMS are needed to staff those new facilities. Certainly the budget also plays an important role in supporting the city's future growth and development, and the capital budget represents the city's investment in the infrastructure, water, sewer, streets, and other things to serve new development. The council also is entitled to have their policy priorities fulfilled in the budgeting process, and deciding if cost of living or inflationary pay increases will be granted. The first deadline is April 28th, 2023, which is the deadline for the notice to the county clerk of the budget hearing. So this is the deadline for the city to notify the county clerk in writing of the date, time, and location of the city's budget hearing for the upcoming fiscal year. And failing to do this will mean that the city is not able to increase the property tax portion of your budget. So very important to make sure that you follow through with that notice in writing to the county clerk of the date of the city's budget hearing. And that information is then included on the tax notices that go out this summer. So that's where that information is used. Every spring, the city begins the budgeting process and normally provides a calendar of deadlines and meetings, as well as forms for city departments to make their budget requests. The department budget requests are checked for mathematical accuracy and compiled into a draft budget. City staff make projections for the major city revenue sources, including revenue sharing, highway distribution account, state liquor fund revenues, fine revenues, and other city revenues. And you can also find projections for revenue sharing and highway distribution account in the AIC budget manual. But we do not provide projections for the state liquor fund, since those are allocated on a point of sale basis. That makes it really tough for us to project those. And there are a lot of local dynamics involved in how much revenue cities receive from the state liquor fund because of that point of sale revenue distribution there. So that's the exception. AIC does not provide projections for the state liquor fund revenues, but we do for revenue sharing as well as the highway distribution account. And the elected officials then review the draft budget and make suggestions to bring it into balance and implement their policy priorities, often at budget workshop council meetings. So once the budget has been balanced, meaning that the expenditures are balanced with the revenues that the city is projecting, and the elected officials are happy with the general direction of it, then the council provides its tentative approval, and the budget is reflected in the council meeting minutes. And the budget and notice of public hearing on the budget are published twice in the official city newspaper at least 7 days apart. And this act of setting the budget is important because it establishes a ceiling on the total level of spending and the city's property tax levy that you cannot exceed in the later stages of the process. And for that reason, it's wise to set both of those on the high side. Make sure that the city's total level of spending and the property tax levy that you set in the notice of budget hearing is on the high side. You can always come down in the final steps of the process, but you can't go up from what you've published in that notice of budget hearing. So the elements of the budget that's included as well as published in the newspaper include actual revenues and expenses for the prior fiscal year, budgeted revenues and expenses for the current fiscal year, projected revenues and expenses for the upcoming fiscal year. Spending is classified by department, fund, or service. Again, the city's property tax levy in dollars for the upcoming fiscal year, setting that on the high side so that you can come down in the final steps of the process. And revenues are classified by source. The last day for the city budget hearing is September 6, 2023, and at the hearing, citizens can testify concerning the proposed budget. Effective July 1st of 2016, there's now a process for cities that wish to levy for foregone property taxes that includes adopting a resolution of intent and providing notice and holding a public hearing. We'll discuss more on that in a few minutes. And there's also a relatively new law effective July 1st, 2020, that cities that wish to accrue all or part of their foregone levying authority to use in a future year must pass an annual resolution to do so, provide notice, and hold a public hearing. And we'll also discuss that more in detail later in the property tax section. So the deadline around which all the other deadlines are oriented is the L2 filing deadline, which is September 7, 2023. And this is really the drop-dead deadline to certify the city's property tax levy to the county commissioners by filing the L2 form, along with a certified copy of the city budget. There is an option, if the county commissioners grant you this request, to have an extension. I think it's a 1-week extension, but it's rare that they will grant that because they have so many deadlines of their own to comply with. And so September 7th, 2023 is the deadline for the city to file the L2 property tax certification form with the county, and the L2 form has to include on it all of your property tax levies, including any voter-approved bonds or levies that have been approved by the voters. So very important to have multiple people review the L2 form because the consequences of making mistakes on it can be severe. You can be prevented from making those levies that year, and so you really want to have an accurate L2 form and make sure that multiple people review that. The next deadline is the end of the month of September, which is the deadline for the city to adopt and publish the appropriations ordinance. The appropriations ordinance sets the legal spending authority for city funds or departments, and it must be passed by the council and published within 30 days after passage, once as a legal notice in the official newspaper by September 29, 2023, or the end of the month of September, for in advance of the change of the fiscal year on October 1st. The appropriations ordinance can be amended during the fiscal year to reflect additional revenue if the city receives grants or has increases in utility fees or other increases in non-property tax revenues. The process to amend the appropriations ordinance is the same as for original adoption: 2 published legal notices at least 7 days apart, a public hearing, the council passes the ordinance, and the ordinance is published after passage once as a legal notice. It is important for the appropriations ordinance amendment to be approved by the council before the money is spent. This slide is a way of providing some helpful hints and ways of prioritizing all of the competing budgetary things that you'll be facing. Budgeting for cities is really a competition for very scarce revenues, and so there's a lot of competing programs and departments that are out there looking to try to do what they can in this process. So this slide is a way of giving you some thoughts about ways to evaluate those, ways to prioritize these competing budgetary proposals that the council will get. And so obviously, if something is mandated, that represents the highest claim on the city's resources. And so anytime a program or spending is mandated by the state or federal government, that means that we have to comply as cities. And mandated spending is really the highest claim on our resources and has to be fulfilled before the other optional things that are more discretionary in nature. So mandated expenditures, and cities face real significant mandates, particularly with the federal Clean Water Act and requirements to upgrade our water treatment and wastewater treatment facilities. So those things are real. The impact and the fiscal impact of mandates is real, and it is important to make sure that those are always prioritized in the budget process. Increasing productivity among city employees is always a good idea, as well as reducing liability exposure. ICRIMP will be very grateful for any steps that the city can take with new programs or services to reduce liability exposure. Advancing the priorities of elected officials is always important. Trying to balance overtime, particularly in police and fire, making sure that that doesn't become too expensive and eating up too much of the city budget, thinking about ways to manage that with additional staffing or resources. It is very difficult in the budgeting process to accurately predict what the city's revenues and expenses are going to be this far in advance. Accurately predicting what fuel costs are going to be effectively in 2 years from now, or health insurance costs, is really challenging. And sometimes revenues and expenditures move in directions that are completely unexpected. The city may have needs that are completely unexpected. You may have a water main break that needs to be fixed, and so you have to reprioritize things, and the budget is really a work in progress. And sometimes the predictions, the best predictions and estimates that we can come up with, sometimes fall short, and reality has a way of intervening in all of our lives. So it's important to make sure that you're preserving enough flexibility to deal with those situations that may occur. Ensuring that programs can offset its costs is important. And the 2 foundational principles of government budgeting that are really critical: don't spend one-time money for ongoing expenses, and don't spend it all, build up your reserves. One-time money could include money that a city would get from, say, the sale of land or a building, or maybe perhaps a one-time temporary increase in a state shared revenue source that's not going to recur into the future. And when that happens, it's important to spend that money on one-time expenses, not ongoing expenses. One-time expenses could include capital facilities or equipment purchases. Building up the city's reserves is obviously good use of one-time money. But plugging one-time money into your budget for ongoing expenses means that you will have a hole in the future to fill that will be very challenging. Now, the last, in classic Idaho fashion, building up reserves, saving money for a rainy day is always very important. Reserves preserve the city's flexibility to meet the challenges that it's going to face in the future, and that is always very important. So building up your reserves to preserve the city's ability to meet the future challenges is always critical. So the other budgeting training and resources that will be coming out, we mentioned the budget manual that will be coming out in a few weeks. The AIC annual conference, June 21st through the 23rd in Boise, will have sessions on budgeting, as will the ICCTFOA Institute in September. And there are also AIC online training videos and a section on the AIC website with budgeting training and resources. So now we'll cover property taxes and the impact of property taxes on the city's budget. Property taxes are a city's most significant general fund revenue source and have been around for a long time. They've funded local government in Idaho since territorial days. In fact, the newspapers used to have huge sections where people's, in the old days, where people's individual tax bill was listed in the newspaper as a legal notice. And so all of their property in the old days, back in the early part of the 20th century and late 19th century, all of your property would be listed in this newspaper legal notice. So your amount of chickens and hogs and cattle, any equipment that you had would be listed, and your tax bill was listed there for everybody to see. And they foreclosed on property relatively quickly back in those days. So it was, at that time, a system that was very non-technical in nature, and it now seems very complex, but at that time it was much more basic in the way that it was administered. But the foundational event for property taxes in Idaho was the passage by the voters of the 1% initiative in 1978 that severely restricted property tax levies. And that was influenced by a rapid increase in the amount of homeowners' assessments throughout the late 60s and early 1970s. And so since the 1% initiative, local governments have operated under a variety of first budget freezes. So we had a property tax budget freeze that was in effect for the first 2 or 3 years after the 1% initiative, and then different flavors of property tax caps of different severity have been in existence since. But the key point is that your city's current budget capacity largely reflects the population and budget capacity that your city had from the late 1970s, which is brutal because there are a lot of cities like Hayden and Ammon and Greenleaf that were tiny bedroom communities at that time that have now grown into being much larger cities with a much larger population to serve. So the property tax caps don't really fully reflect the nature and the significance of the change that Idaho has gone through with the growth that we've seen since the late 1970s. The current budget cap is an 8% cap that starts with calculating a 3% inflation factor. So cities can increase the property tax portion of their budget by an inflation factor of up to 3% over the highest dollar levy for any of the 3 preceding tax years. And this calculation uses a preliminary levy rate that includes the most current taxable market value, except for the centrally assessed operating property, which uses the prior year's values. So the 8% cap, the first part in calculating it is the council deciding which part or all of the 3% inflation factor, and whether they're going to use part or all of that 3% that's allowed as your inflation factor. So the maximum increase under the 8% cap, including new construction and annexation levies, cannot exceed 8%, except for terminating, de-annexing, or plan modification for a revenue allocation area of an urban renewal district or foregone levies. Levies for new construction and annexation under the 8% cap are restricted to 90% of the taxable market value of each. And the fact that those things no longer fully cover the cost of new construction and annexation are one of the reasons why many cities are looking at development impact fees as one way of covering some of the shortfall that's been caused by the new budget restriction under House Bill 389 and the new 8% cap that doesn't allow cities to have new development fully covering its costs under this new 90% of taxable market value for new construction and annexation. So cities are looking hard at development impact fees and making sure that these impact fees that cover the cost of capital facilities for new development are, fully covering the costs that they're incurring with growth. There's also an exception for terminating, de-annexing, or plan modification for a revenue allocation area of an urban renewal district, and that value is added to the new construction rule at 80% of actual value for revenue allocation areas that are formed after December 31st, 2006. There are a few different temporary and permanent property tax override alternatives. There is a permanent override for cities that have low tax levies under 0.004, where they can increase their levy to that level, 0.004, with 60% voter approval. There's also the ability to have temporary overrides for up to 2 years in duration upon a simple majority vote. And there's also permanent property tax overrides that can be approved by a 2/3 majority vote. Very important to make sure that you have public support prior to placing an override levy measure on the ballot. So we'll now discuss how cities structure their property tax levies and the options and reasons for having a general fund levy versus special levies. So cities can have a general fund levy of up to 0.009 on the taxable market value within the city, and that revenue can be spent for any lawful purpose. It's not restricted. It can be spent by the city for any of its tax-supported services. Cities can also make what are called special levies for specific purposes, including airports, cemeteries, libraries, capital improvement fund, streets, and recreation. And we've given you the levy limits for those on this slide. It's important to note that when you make a special levy for this specific purpose, that the revenue has to be spent for that specific purpose. So if the city makes a cemetery levy, then you would break that out as a special levy on the L2 form and say, we're going to make a cemetery levy of 0.004. The revenue from that specific levy, the tax revenue, has to be spent for the cemetery. And it's also the case with the library special levy, capital improvement fund, all of those special levies. The revenue that you get from those has to be spent for that specific purpose. You can't transfer it to other funds. So that's why cities generally like making the general fund levy alone, because that gives them the greatest degree of flexibility to decide how they're going to spend the money and move money around if they have to during the fiscal year. That's not quite as challenging. So unless your city is close to the .009 level for the general fund levy limit, it usually makes sense to just make one general fund levy and then split that out among the various tax-supported services. Cities receive the new construction roll by the fourth Monday in July, and that includes taxable assessed market value increases from new structures that are built in the community, or additions or alterations of existing non-residential structures, as well as new or used manufactured housing that's installed. Make sure to carefully review the new construction roll annually, and you can compare it to the building permits that were issued for the previous year. It's not unheard of to find errors on the new construction roll, and let the assessor know if you find any discrepancies. That can be a real benefit for both the city and the county, finding revenue and levying capacity on the new construction roll. So make sure to check the new construction roll against your building permits and make sure that it's accurate. So when a city chooses to budget less than the maximum amount that's allowed by the 8% cap, these foregone revenues accumulate and they can be included in a future budget. And the purpose is to ensure that you aren't required to take the maximum tax increase every year to protect your levying authority in future years. And foregone levies have resulted in over $100 million in tax relief for property taxpayers over the past 20 years. Foregone revenues are exempt from the 8% cap. And there is now a process to accrue foregone. House Bill 354 that was passed by the 2020 Idaho legislature requires each city to pass a resolution every year to accrue foregone property tax levying authority to use in a future year. If the city doesn't pass the resolution, that year's foregone amount would be forfeited permanently, but the city would still retain previous foregone levying authority that was already accrued. The city needs to publish the notice of the intent to accrue the foregone in the official newspaper twice, at least 7 days apart, and there must be a public hearing, and the process for passing the foregone accrual resolution is the same as and can be done together with the city's budget notice and hearing. So once the council passes the foregone accrual resolution, that resolution has to be filed with the county with the L2 property tax levy form. The foregone that you reserve can only be for the year that the city is filing the L2 form, and you can't accrue multiple years of foregone in one resolution. And the resolution needs to also specify the exact dollar amount of foregone that the council is reserving. There's also a process for levying foregone involving a council resolution. So the council passes a resolution stating the intent to budget foregone property tax revenues, the amount of foregone revenues to be budgeted, the purposes for which those revenues are being budgeted, and then you need to have public notice and hearing. The notice published twice, at least 7 days apart, as a legal notice and a hearing, and the notice and hearing can be done together with your annual budget hearing. Now we'll cover budgeting non-property tax revenues. And the difference between taxes and fees is important, and understanding what that difference means for elected officials is important. So in Idaho, under Idaho law, fees that cities charge for their services must be reasonably related to and cannot exceed the cost of providing the service. So this nexus between the cost of providing the service and the level of the fee, the amount of the fee, is important, and cities can be challenged in court if people think that the fees that they're charging are in excess of the costs of providing the service, and that the city's effectively creating an illegal tax. And so courts can strike down city fees where they feel like there's not a close enough nexus between what the city is charging, the amount that they're charging, and the services that they're providing for that. So it is important to do your due diligence with fees and make sure that you're not exceeding the cost of providing the service. There are a variety of different types of fees that we've listed on this slide. And any time that the city is establishing a new fee or increasing existing fees more than 5%, you're required to provide legal notice that's published twice, once each week, for the 2 weeks before the week of the hearing, and hold a public hearing before adopting the fee increase or new fee. Now we'll cover the sales tax revenue sharing program that allocates $270 million annually to local governments, and this allocates 11.5% of state sales tax revenue to cities, counties, and non-school special districts. Revenue sharing is general fund revenue unless the city chooses to dedicate it for a specific purpose. There were major reforms to the revenue sharing distribution formula that were made by House Bill 408 that was passed in 2020. And House Bill 408 reformed the revenue sharing distribution with the goal of having it be allocated on a population basis in the future. So the next few decades really will be spent bringing the revenue sharing distribution in line on a per capita basis or a population basis. So cities that have high per capita distributions now will see at the most 1% annual revenue increases if the economy is growing, and cities that have low per capita distributions will see most of the increased revenue in the future if the economy is growing, and will be somewhat protected when revenue drops. So House Bill 408 took effect July 1st, 2020. It established new quarterly base amounts for FY 2020 for each city based on their quarterly revenue sharing distribution. Also established an annual per capita revenue sharing amount for each city based on the previous fiscal year's receipts. If there's no change in the amount of revenue sharing from the same quarter of the previous fiscal year, then cities receive the same distribution amount. When revenue for the current quarter is greater than the amount for the same quarter of the previous fiscal year, if the distributions to cities during the same quarter of the previous fiscal year are below the base amount for FY 2020, then all cities receive a proportional increase up to the base amount and up to a 1% increase over the base amount, and any remaining monies are allocated to cities with below average per capita distributions in proportion to that city's population share of the population of all cities with below average per capita distribution. When revenue for the current quarter is greater than the amount for the same quarter of the previous fiscal year, and distributions made to cities during the same quarter of the previous fiscal year are at or above the base amount for FY 2020, then cities receive the same amount from the same quarter of the previous fiscal year, plus a proportional increase up to 1%, and any remaining monies are allocated to cities with below average per capita distributions in proportion to that city's population share of the population of all cities with a below average per capita distribution. If revenue declines below the amount for the same quarter of the previous fiscal year, each city receives a proportional reduction down to the quarterly base amount for FY 2020, and if further reductions are needed, they would be based on the proportion that the city's population bears to the population of all cities within the state. So this graph shows the history of revenue sharing over the past couple of decades. You'll see that it's been starting off in FY99, you have a fairly consistent rate of increase that then accelerates as you hit FY04 through FY07, which was the peak of the pre-Great Recession development boom. And then in the wake of the Great Recession in FY08, 09, and 10, there was a decline of 17% in revenue sharing amounts to cities. So that was the most significant revenue hit that revenue sharing had taken in decades. It was really unprecedented, but it does show you the extent to which development activity and sales tax revenue are connected. And so that's what you'll notice on this slide is the pace of development activity really influences a great degree the percentage of revenue sharing that cities receive. And then the huge outlier is the pandemic shopping boom of starting FY20 and then extending through 22 and 23, which we've seen a really high rate of increase there for revenue sharing, mostly due to pandemic-related shopping, maybe not quite as much development activity. And so there's been a substantial increase in the revenue that cities have received in revenue sharing. But as we see on the next slide, it's our belief that that is now starting to tail off. And so the most recent quarters have been in the 8 to 9% increase range. And so AIC is revising our projection for FY 2023 for revenue sharing so that we are now at plus 9%, as opposed to originally we were at 12% increase. And for FY 2024, we're projecting a 6.5% increase in the total revenue sharing dollars to cities. So that's still an increase, but the rate of the increase is going to slow substantially. And the revenue sharing projections, again, are based on the state fiscal year, which runs July 1st through June 30th. The highway distribution account distributes revenue from state fuel tax, vehicle registration, fines and fees, and state sales tax. And local highway jurisdictions receive 39.5% of this revenue. And of that, cities receive 30%, which is distributed solely based on population. The revenue needs to be used for developing, constructing, or maintaining highways and bridges, primarily benefiting vehicles. And this latter part of the sentence about primarily benefiting vehicles we'll discuss in a couple of the legislative proposals that we'll be closing out the presentation discussing. So that's new language that is courtesy of the legislature this year. One of the most important transportation funding increase bills was in 2015, and House Bill 312 was the bill that finally broke the long drought for transportation revenue increases after 1996. So there was a huge long gap of decades where there was not any no new revenue coming in for state or local transportation funding. And so that built up hundreds of millions of dollars in pent-up needs and backlogs and underfunding that really was crippling our state's infrastructure. And so the first steps at fixing that situation were with House Bill 312 that passed in 2015 that added $100 million annually for state and local transportation needs through an increased vehicle registration fees and a 7-cent per gallon fuel tax increase. And cities received an additional $13 million annually for street and bridge maintenance under House Bill 312. That was an increase of 30%. A more recent and significant piece of transportation funding legislation is House Bill 362, which increased the distribution of sales tax revenue for transportation from 1% to 4.5% of revenue, and that is taken out after revenue sharing and does not impact the revenue sharing distribution to local governments. So House Bill 362 provided a minimum of $80 million annually for ITD to dedicate for major projects on the state highway system, and local highway jurisdictions, including cities, counties, and highway districts, receive the revenue over the $80 million dedicated to ITD allocated through the Highway Distribution Account formula. And House Bill 362 is going to be one of the faster growing sources of transportation revenue since it's tied to sales tax. So, as you will see on this slide, giving the revenue history of the different sources, that tells really the story of the old formula, the Highway Distribution Account old formula, that was last increased in 1996. And we went decades with that revenue really languishing. It didn't increase, and it wasn't until the new revenues started happening in 2015 that we started to see an injection of new money into the system. And also at that time, you started to see gas prices dropping and people switching to pickups and SUVs as the vehicles that they were choosing to buy. So you had an acceleration in the gas tax revenue component of the old Highway Distribution Account formula from 2015 to 2019. And so what we're now seeing is that as fuel prices have peaked over the last couple of years, they're very high. People are struggling with inflation. And so the old formula and the House Bill 362 money isn't increasing nearly as fast as it has been. And so the general fund money that the state sends, as well as the House Bill 362 money based on sales tax, are going to be the parts of the transportation funding equation in the future that will be growing at a more rapid pace. So our projection for Highway Distribution Account is a 1.5% increase for the old formula for FY 2024, and that matches the actual increase from FY 2022. We're projecting a 1.5% decline in the House Bill 312 money, which is pretty close to a 1.7% decline in FY 2022. And AIC is projecting a 6.5% increase for FY 2024 for the House Bill 362 money. And again, these projections are based on the state fiscal year, which runs July 1st through June 30th. But yes, you'll see that there's a fairly consistent rate of increase in the old formula from FY 2015 through FY 2019. We were at a really nice increases of 3 to 5% per year. Those were very solid, and now that rate of increase is much less. We're now in the 1% or 1.5% range for the old formula, which is disappointing and probably will continue until fuel prices drop and we see demand spike because of relief in fuel prices or relief from inflation. The state liquor account distributes profits of state liquor stores to the state, cities, and counties, and the profits are split equally between the state and cities and counties. And the local government share is allocated 49% to cities, 36% to counties, and 15% to magistrate court funding. The city's portion is allocated 90% to cities with liquor stores on a point of sale basis. So the profits from that their stores in the community are then sent to the community. So the city gets the amount of revenue that's generated from their liquor stores, if they have a liquor store within the city limits, and then 10% is allocated to cities that don't have liquor stores on a population basis. Each city is entitled to receive the amount distributed during FY 1981, which is a hold harmless provision, and the state liquor account revenue is general fund revenue unless the city chooses to dedicate it for a specific purpose. This slide shows how crazy the distributions in the state liquor account have been. You had a really rapid rate of increase from 05 to 08, 09. And at that point, as the state was getting into a recession, the state decided to renegotiate the distribution formula to increase their share. And so from FY 09 and 10, 11, and 12, the state got most of the increase in the liquor profits because they got the benefit of having an increased share under the state law. So they demanded that we renegotiate that, and Ken Harward, our executive director at the time, did that and came up with what we felt was the best that we could negotiate. And so it ended up with a 50-50 split between the state and the local governments. And recently, there was a very rapid rate of increase over FY 20 and 21, as you saw a huge amount of pandemic liquor buying. People feared that liquor stores are going to close, or that they might not be able to access them, and so people kind of went crazy buying liquor. And it's rare to see declines in state liquor account revenue. You only see 3 years of declines on the spread on the graph here, and so we're seeing one this year in FY 22 as the crazy pandemic-induced liquor purchases are normalizing a little bit. But that revenue is one of the fairly consistent increases of revenue to cities. House Bill 643 was a bill that was passed that was supported by AIC as well as the Idaho Association of Counties to provide sustainable long-term funding for magistrate courts and get cities out of having to provide court facilities, staffing, and equipment. And there was a work group that looked at the issue of magistrate court funding that included mayors, county commissioners, and court administrators. And their decision was to recommend dedicating a portion of state liquor account revenues, the growth of future revenues, to provide a sustainable funding source for magistrate courts. So beginning in FY 2019, 2.2% of cities' liquor revenue is dedicated to court funding each fiscal year for the next 5 fiscal years, for a total of 11% in FY 2023. So we've now hit the total of 11% distribution. So that should mean that cities will see some additional revenue in the future, since that amount we've hit now the phase-in for the 5-year phase-in for the implementation of the diversion under House Bill 643. This comes off the top of the city's distribution and impacts cities differently depending on their liquor revenue growth trends. So if your city was one of those that had rapid growth in state liquor account revenue prior to FY 2019, then it was prudent to plan for no increase or a very small increase until the House Bill 643 was fully phased in over 5 years. If the city's liquor account revenues were flat prior to FY 2019, then it was prudent to budget for a small decrease. And for cities that were losing revenue before FY 2019, then they faced the reality of having to plan for a somewhat larger decline over the next 5 fiscal years. But again, as that reaches the stage of being fully implemented in FY 2023, that should mean that there's not quite as direct of an impact in the future growth of the state liquor account revenue. So there are other city revenue sources, miscellaneous sources of revenue. Cities do receive 90% of fine revenue exclusive of court costs when city ordinances are violated or when citations are made by city officers. And that includes county sheriff's deputies that are acting under contract by a city to provide law enforcement service. So cities do receive 90% of fine revenue. That is one of the miscellaneous revenue sources to keep track of in budgeting. There are also revenues from licenses and permits. Franchise fees are fees that are charged to power, natural gas, and water utilities and cable television providers for using public rights-of-way. And these are set in state law. There are specific processes that the cities have to go through for adopting these franchise fees and franchise ordinances. Those are charged to these public service providers for using public rights-of-way. And resort cities that are under 10,000 population can enact alcohol by the drink, hotel motel occupancy, and or general sales taxes with 60% voter approval. So there are lots of resort cities that have local option taxes as a way of helping to provide property tax relief for the city's residents and homeowners. We'll now cover quickly a few new laws on budgeting and revenues. And the most significant one from the property tax perspective is House Bill 292, which is a comprehensive property tax relief bill that brought together the House and Senate approaches for property tax relief. And House Bill 292 includes direct tax relief for homeowners in the form of a homeowner's credit that they will get on their tax bills, reducing their tax bill. There's also revenue going to schools to replace property tax funded bonds and levies. The legislature also broadened eligibility for the circuit breaker to help elderly, low-income, and disabled folks pay their property taxes, broaden the eligibility for circuit breaker relief. The bill also eliminates the March school bond and levy election date, but does keep the August, May, and November election dates. And the Wayfair revenue remains in the tax relief fund under House Bill 292, but cities are relieved of the need to fund public defense from revenue sharing. So that is one of the compensating reasons for why the AIC board decided to support the bill. The bill won't impact your property tax levying or budget process or the deadlines that are associated with those areas. All of that will remain the same as under the current law. So House Bill 292 is actually one of the most positive property tax relief developments for homeowners in a decade, and so homeowners should get about 2/3 of the relief. That's why the AIC Board of Directors voted to support the bill. The bill passed the House and Senate by wide margins and then was vetoed by the governor over concerns about funding for the Transportation Expansion and Congestion Mitigation Program, the TECM program. So trailer bills quickly passed both the House and Senate to clarify TECM funding and appropriate funding for House Bill 292. The House and Senate then overrode the governor's veto of House Bill 292 by wide margins, and the bill becomes law immediately. So how will this work for cities? The homeowner's credit will provide a direct property tax credit for those who qualify for the homeowner's exemption, and this will cover their property taxes that are not voter-approved bonds or levies. and every homeowner in the county will get the same percentage reduction of their property tax bill under that part of the legislation. So this part, the homeowner's credit, will be fairly predictable, straightforward, and will offer uniform relief to homeowners. The schools portion will be much more variable and depend greatly on the local bonds and levies that have been issued by the school district. That part of the legislation will have much more variable impact and much more variable relief going to different locations because of the different amount of bonds and levies that they've issued. But the homeowner's credit will be the more straightforward part that will be more predictable, and they will get the same percentage reduction for homeowners in each county. So by December 20th each year, the State Tax Commission will pay to each county tax collector the first half of the reimbursement revenue for the homeowner's credit, and the remainder will be paid along with a second half payment by June 20th each year. And the replacement revenue will be paid to taxing districts in the same way and together with our property tax payments from the county. So it will be very straightforward to administer. We will not have any specific administrative requirements to fulfill. The counties will be taking care of administering basically all of this, and the revenue for the homeowner's credit will flow to us through the regular property tax payments that we receive from the county. Another piece of legislation, House Bill 22, that we want you to be aware of, prohibits any city or county from issuing an ordinance, resolution, executive order, or proclamation refusing to investigate or enforce any felony established by Idaho Code. And after the Attorney General has determined that a local government has violated this law, their sales tax revenue distribution payments are withheld until the law, policy, or order is repealed. House Bill 22 does take effect immediately, so important to be aware of that and the consequences under House Bill 22 if you violate that provision of law. House Bills 87 and 237 are two of several bills that followed in the wake of the election of new pro-pedestrian commissioners to the Ada County Highway District. And so these are bills that really were introduced with the purpose of clarifying laws that revenues that local governments receive have to be spent for the primary benefit of motor vehicles. And so House Bill 87 provides that for the Transportation Expansion and Congestion Mitigation Program, the TECM program, that monies received by local highway jurisdictions have to be used for road and bridge maintenance, expanding travel lanes, and congestion mitigation, primarily for the benefit of motor vehicles to improve traffic flow and traffic travel times. House Bill 237 provides that highway user revenues must be used for the operation, administration, maintenance, construction, and development of bridges and highways that primarily benefit motor vehicles in the local highway jurisdiction. Both these bills take effect July 1st, 2023. And as we heard from the sponsors of these bills, they were very clear that primary does not mean exclusive. Primary means primary. So that doesn't mean that you are legally prohibited from using the money for the TECM program and highway user revenues for pedestrian projects, just that the primary benefit of those projects has to be for motor vehicles. So important to be aware of that. Make sure to have your city attorney review that and make sure that you're compliant with that language in House Bills 87 and 237. House Bill 18 is an AIC-supported bill that removed the sunset clause from the enabling legislation that allowed first responders to have post-traumatic stress injury, PTSI, covered by workers' compensation as an occupational injury. This takes effect July 1st, 2023, And the original bill that AIC supported several years ago included a sunset clause so that they could determine whether there was a significant financial impact that had occurred as a result of the passage of this bill to extend workers' compensation coverage to first responders for PTSI, post-traumatic stress injury. And as local governments have been informed, their workers' comp rates have not been significantly impacted by that legislation, and so it was broadly supported to remove the sunset clause and allow that to continue in place for the future. So again, House Bill 18, that will take effect July 1st, 2023, removing the sunset clause on the PTSI workers' comp enabling legislation. House Bill 90 is an AIC-sponsored bill that will help cities that are struggling with the publication of notices and that are dealing with newspapers that either fail to publish legal notices or publish legal notices with errors in them. And every year, cities face this very significant challenge when they're going through the budgeting process of a newspaper that forgets to publish a legal notice for the budget notice, or that publishes one with errors. And so House Bill 90 gives you a hold harmless provision in state law that says that you can't be held liable when a newspaper fails to publish a legal notice or incorrectly publishes a legal notice. And it also allows us to use the date of electronic publication on the idahopublicnotices.com website to satisfy the publication requirements under state law or administrative rule. So in the case that the newspaper fails to publish a notice or incorrectly publishes a notice, you can use the electronic publication on the idahopublicnotices.com website in addition to whatever method the local government determines in good faith is feasible to meet the notice requirements. So this has been one of the real challenges in budgeting, and there are real hard stop deadlines in this process for filing the L2 form that don't allow us to republish notices when there are mistakes or when newspapers failed to publish the legal notices. And so this bill will provide a significant amount of help and relief in this area, and we're very happy about the bill passing and grateful for the legislature passing it. House Bill 354 is a transportation appropriation bill, and again, after years of local highway jurisdictions struggling to fund road and bridge maintenance and construction, the state of Idaho has really stepped up to commit their resources and support, and the bill continues the governor's policy of using state surplus revenues for local roads and bridges to provide property tax relief and getting the best bang for the buck with these investment of state dollars. House Bill 354 will transfer $245 million for FY 2023 for local bridge maintenance, pedestrian and safety projects, and grants to Idaho airports. The bill also appropriates $402.8 million for FY 2024 for road and bridge maintenance, transportation capacity and safety projects, statewide transportation projects, local road and bridge maintenance projects, and local transportation projects, including $121 million from the state general fund to the local highway distribution fund. So again, we are grateful for the state's support. Grateful to Governor Little and the legislature for providing help for transportation funding in this way, and it really is very meaningful assistance, and local governments should be very grateful for that. So with that, today's presentation is concluded. Remember, if you have any questions on the budgeting process, don't hesitate to reach out to the AIC office, and we are there to help you, and the AIC budget manual will be coming out shortly in a few weeks. Thanks again, and enjoy the Spring District Workshop.